From 1997 to 2007, Wizards hosted a Magic the Gathering Invitational tournament, and among the prizes were the ability to help design a card with the R&D, as well as getting your likeness on that card's art. This tradition was continued with the World Championship winner in more recent years, giving us a total of 14 cards that were designed in part by and bear the likeness of a professional Magic the Gathering player. And as you might expect, most of these cards have ended up being quite powerful. Today, we're going to go over the best of these cards made by the best. Starting us off at number 10, we have Avalanche Riders. This is a 2/2 human nomad with a mana cost of 3 and 1 red. It has haste, allowed to attack the turn it enters a battlefield, and has echo for 3 and 1 red. This means that the turn after it enters a battlefield, during your upkeep, you either need to pay the echo cost or sacrifice the creature. Finally, when Riders enters the battlefield, you destroy target land. This is quite the powerful card just on rate despite its small size. This is mostly due to how powerful land destruction as an effect is. The best rate you'll usually find for these kinds of land destructions is 3 mana, and Rider only asks for 1 extra mana to get a 2/2 body. Unfortunately, you do have to pay a hefty echo cost to keep it around, but this can often be worth it. If you're playing a lot of cards like Pillage to blow up all their lands, they probably won't be playing much on their turn anyway. This will give you a lot more leeway to keep Riders around and put more pressure on your opponent. Rider's ability to set your opponent back on mana while also developing your board makes it a great card for aggressive decks. This has allowed the card to see play in multiple formats. In Standard, it was played alongside the best aggressive threats at the time, like Jackal Pup and other land destruction cards, where it functioned as a powerful top-end threat. Since then, it's seen play in a few random decks in Modern that could take advantage of its unique qualities. Before Birthing Pod was banned, it was one of the many tutor targets people would play to blow up problem lands, or set their opponent behind on mana in opportune game states. It has also seen play in Living End decks, a strategy that tried to fill their graveyard with various creatures before cheating out the powerful sorcery to swap all cards in the field with ones in the graveyard. Riders was a pretty strong play here, as it would destroy a land when it came down, die to echo, and then get reanimated with Living End and blow up a second land, putting you way far ahead of your opponent. Now, while Riders is fairly strong, its high mana value has stopped it from seeing too much play in Eternal formats. Still, the card has put up enough results to make it onto this list. At number 9, we have Solemn Simulacrum. This is a 2/2 golem artifact creature with a mana cost of 4. It has the abilities where, when it enters the battlefield, you search your library for a basic land card and put it into the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. Whenever it dies, you draw a card. Solemn is a card that's very good on rate, getting you a ton of value off of the enter the battlefield and dies triggers. Ramping is a very powerful effect, as having extra mana can simply allow you to play more cards or play more powerful cards than your opponent each turn. Drawing a card to replace itself whenever it dies also allows it to trade for far more favorably in combat. Your opponent can never really swing into Solemn with a 2 toughness creature, as allowing you to kill one of their attackers and draw a card is just too big of a swing in your favor. Using it to chump block is also made a lot more attractive by these abilities, as at that point it will have given you more mana to make more plays, saved you some life, and drawn you a card, letting you set up for the long game better while not being too bad on tempo. It really needs these upsides because the stats are very small for the cost. This leads to Solemn being a very balanced card, which can kind of kill any chance of it seeing play in older formats where you have to be doing something a little broken to see play. However, in Standard, the card has seen tons of play just about every time it's been printed. Both mid-range and ramp decks play the card as a way to simultaneously protect their life total, while also pulling up more mana for a later turn. It would take far too long to go over every place the card has seen play, as a huge number of decks have found what Solemn has to offer enticing. And a big reason for that is that the card is colorless. Green gets access to cards like the Nora Elves and Rampant Growth all the time, but most colors don't get access to ramp. They instead have to rely on cards like Manalith, which are far less efficient or reliable. Solemn giving things like blue-black decks access to ramp spells is an effect that the colors don't get access to very often. So Solemn has seen a ton of play simply because it's the only reasonable option for mana acceleration in a lot of color combinations. There are additional upsides to the card as well, as you can do things like flicker it to get more lands or reanimate it from your graveyard for largely the same purpose, which certain decks running have done through different standards. Solemn is a card that's just very good all around that can be made much better depending on exactly what cards it happens to be legal with. And at number 8, we have Ranger of Eos. This is a 3/2 human soldier with a mana cost of 3 and 1 white. It has the ability where, when it enters the battlefield, you search your library for up to 2 creature cards with a mana value of 1 or less, reveal them and put them into your hand, then shuffle. Ranger's ability to tutor for 2 cards when it enters the battlefield is obviously very strong, though being limited to such a small number of cards does balance it out. Tutors generally get better the larger their card pool, so it's probably no surprise the card is a bit more remembered for its play in Eternal formats as opposed to Standard. That's not to say it skipped over Standard entirely though. The card did see play as a refill in aggro decks during the Standard, as it had quite a few good 1-drops to grab. Usually be grabbing cards like Figure of Destiny, an incredibly powerful scaling 1-drop. Throughout its time in Standard, it was used in much the same way, just drawing more threats in whatever deck was using it. In Modern, the card has been used in a few different ways. It was employed similarly to Standard in some decks, just drawing 2 threats of your choice. It was used to grab cards like Wild Nacatl, which in the right decks was a 1-mana 3/3. This card was also used in Birthing Pod decks before the banning, being used to find cards like Birds of Paradise for more mana or finding combo pieces like Viscera Seer. It was also used in some earlier builds of Death's Shadow, a powerful 1-mana threat that grows bigger the lower your life total is, to grab more of the eponymous threat. Getting 2 shadows on board is very hard to beat, so Ranger was very scary to see come down. It also saw play in Soul Sisters decks built around the 1-drop Soul's Attendant and Soul Warden, which give you life whenever a creature enters the battlefield, along with playing Martyr of Sands. A 1-mana creature lets you pay 1, sacrifice it, and reveal any number of white cards from your hand to gain 3 times X life. This deck had a ton of ways to take advantage of gaining life, and being able to find 2 of your 3 build-arounds for 4 mana can let you go on to the moon. Ranger can also fill your hand with more white cards for Martyr to give you even more life. Ranger hasn't seen as much play as it may seem though, simply because of its hefty mana cost. However, the card has recently received an upgraded version in Ranger Captain of Eos. This card only finds you a single 1-mana creature, but only costs 3 mana and has the powerful ability where you can sacrifice it so you can make it so your opponent can't cast non-creature spells this turn. This card has also seen a bit of play in formats like Modern, though not that extensively. It mostly just shows how impactful the card is in the minds of the player base and the designers, as it was popular enough to receive a new version to try and power up certain decks. And at number 7, we have Fervent Champion. This is a 1/1 human knight with a mana cost of 1 red. It has first strike, meaning it deals combat damage before creatures without first strike, and haste. Whenever it attacks, you give another target attacking knight you control +1/+0 until end of turn, and equip abilities you activate that target champion costs 3 less to activate. Champion is a very strong aggressive creature. While its stats alone aren't amazing, it has a combination of abilities that make it a very attractive choice for a number of decks. The card has 2 abilities that synergize very well with either knights or equipment. For reference, this set Champion was released in Throne of Eldraine. Knights had a pretty big equipment theme, so the 2 things went hand in hand. Unfortunately, the Knights decks just weren't quite there in Standard. Despite this, Champion was still able to see a bit of play in more standard mono-red decks. One reason for this is that the card is quite good in multiples. Each champion can simply buff a different copy, so 2 copies can attack as 2 1/1s with haste and first strike, which is quite threatening. However, in Standard, there are some knights and equipments to pair with the card. Rimrock Knight was played for its ability to pump through damage and then be played afterwards as a threat, and was a good place to put your attack buff from champion if you only had 1 copy. On the more splashy side of things was Embercleave. This was a hugely powerful equipment that defined red aggro decks in Standard, often being used to push for lethal damage out of nowhere thanks to its combination of cost reduction, auto-equipping, and flash allowed to be cast during the combat phase. While this would often just win the game, if your opponent had removal for the creature wearing the Embercleave, it would often take a full turn to equip it again. However, since Embercleave's equip cost is exactly 3, you could just throw it into Champion for free and spend all the rest of your mana on other plays if you wanted to. Now, these upsides were a bit marginal, and Champion probably would have seen play just by itself as a 1/1 with haste and first strike for 1 is pretty above rate. However, utilizing small upsides are what makes the difference between good players and great players, and are the difference between good cards and great cards. And at number 6, we have Faerie Mastermind. This is a 2/1 Fairy Rogue with a mana cost of 1 and 1 blue. It has flash and flying, and the abilities where, whenever an opponent draws their second card on a turn, you draw a card, and you can pay 3 and 1 blue to have each player draw a card. Mastermind has a very powerful effect that can really punish your opponent for getting too greedy. Mastermind does count the card your opponent draws for turn, so if they draw even a single card during their turn, it will trigger and reward you with a card of your own. This is a pretty terrible deal for your opponent, so your opponent will often be forced to try and play around the card to not give you too much card advantage. To sweeten the deal even more, Mastermind can let you forcibly trigger this ability by letting both players draw a card, but netting you another draw after its ability triggers. This is all pretty strong, but not good enough to justify playing a card on its own. If Mastermind were an enchantment or artifact, it likely wouldn't be seen play, but being able to develop your board while also getting these powerful abilities makes the card quite good in tempo decks. In Standard, Mastermind saw play in most creature-based blue decks. One of the most popular of these decks was Esper Raffine, a deck built around Raffine's Scheming Seer. This creature has the ability where, when you attack, you draw X cards and discard X cards, where X is the number of attacking creatures. and for each non-land card you discard, you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature, though all the counters have to go on a single creature. This card could pump out a ton of damage as well as help you find any cards you want, and Mastermind was a great place to put all the counters on top of being a good creature. In older formats, it has seen play in Dimir Rogue. This is a tribal deck that uses a lot of small, evasive creatures to pump through damage. Mastermind is a rogue, and so could benefit from your Thieves Guild Enforcers and Soaring Thought Thief, and all of your tribal synergies. This card hasn't done too much in older formats as its body starts to look worse and worse as formats get faster, so it has to rely on its ability to be good more and more. At that point, there are just some better cards to play that are more disruptive. Still, the card had a great run in Standard. It will probably slot into Temple decks and Pioneer for quite a while. And at number 5, we have Sylvan Safekeeper. This is a human wizard with a mana cost of 1 green. It is the ability where you can sacrifice a land to give target creature you control Shroud until end of turn, which means it can't be the target of any player's spells or abilities. It is notable that you can't target the creature yourself, unlike with Hexproof, as it does say it can't be targets of spells or abilities at all. Still, this doesn't really come up, so the ability might as well be Hexproof. Now, Safekeeper has a pretty big downside, as sacrificing lands is one of the harshest costs Wizards has ever put on a card. If you use Safekeeper too much, you'll obviously end up with no more mana to play any more cards. Still, it can be more than worth it to save an important threat. Not to mention the threat of activation, as your opponent will generally be discouraged to spend their mana on removal instead of developing their own board if they know the spell won't go through. So Safekeeper can make it very difficult for your opponent to target your creatures, though it is very punishing. Players have found several ways to make this ability more effective, however. The land Flagstones of Trocaire replaces itself with the tapped plains from your deck when it's put into the graveyard from the field. So, if you sacrifice it to Safekeeper, you won't actually go down a land. It also works great with Knight of the Reliquary, a creature that gets +1/+1 for each land card in your graveyard. This is a powerful creature that's weak to removal, so Safekeeper and Knight go perfect together. Knight gets bigger and bigger, and if your opponent ever tries to remove it, Safekeeper can save it and pump it up in the process. Legacy not only has these cards, but plenty of their own powerful lands, and Safekeeper is great at protecting your creatures in these decks. Cards like Elvish Reclaimer allow you to tutor for your lands, and making sure you can keep it around to set up your Dark Depths combo can be really powerful. Now, in order to truly make this card shine, you need these powerful land synergies. This is why this is one of the few cards in this list that didn't have much success in Standard, as there weren't too many ways to make sacrificing your lands better. Still, nowadays the card is famous for seeing play in land-based strategies, and won't be budging from that spot in the foreseeable future. And at number 4, we have Meddling Mage. This is a 2/2 human wizard with a mana cost of 1 white and 1 blue. It is the ability's where, as it enters the battlefield, you name a card, and players can't cast spells with that same name as that named card. Mage is a mildly annoying card for some decks to play against, and an absolutely back-breaking card to play against for other decks. Certain decks, namely combo decks, rely entirely on resolving particular cards to win. Decks like Living End will be unable to pull off their combo with a mage naming Living End, which will mean their deck is basically just bad. This will basically force your opponent to find some form of removal before they can try to end the game, which can often be the difference between winning and losing. Mage is often used as a sideboard card, as it's much better in particular matchups than against the average deck in most formats. However, that's not to say the card hasn't seen some main board play. In human tribal decks, the card gets a lot more value as you can pump up your Thalia's Lieutenant and Champion of the Parish, as well as working well with cards like Kite Sail Freebooter, who can let you look at your opponent's hand and get rid of cards until it leaves the field. This means you can call a card you know is in their hand to stop them from being able to play it, essentially getting another card out of their hand. Outside of human tribal, the card has seen far more sparse play in main boards. Without the innate upside of the card being a tribe member, having to blind name a card is just too risky to play the card into an unknown deck. Often you won't even know what your opponent is on, so you'll have no idea what cards are in their deck, let alone their hand. So while the card is mostly limited to the sideboard, the ability to stop your opponent in their tracks while also developing your board allows the card to be something of a staple in sideboards. And at number 3, we have Elite Spellbinder. This is a 3/1 human cleric with a mana cost of 2 and 1 white. It has flying and the ability where, when it enters the battlefield, you look at target opponent's hand. You exile a non-land card from it. For as long as that card is exiled, your opponent can play it, but it costs 2 more to play this way. Spellbinder is a great tempo play, often putting you extremely far ahead. A 3/1 flyer for 3 is a pretty decent rate, though not exciting. The evasion and relatively high power allow it to put your opponent on a decent clock all on its own, which makes its ability to lay an important spell even more backbreaking. Making your opponent pay 2 extra mana for a spell can completely ruin their turn. Players will very rarely be able to cast the spell you took and play another card, instead being forced to play only a single spell on that turn. This can give you a ton of time to develop your own board freely while your opponent either can't play a powerful, important spell you just took from them, or can't play more than one card on that turn. This has allowed Spellbinder to see play in white aggro decks in Standard and Pioneer. Spellbinder is particularly good in aggro decks for its ability to snag powerful single target removal or board wipes that can set aggro decks back on board. Taking an important Wrath in particular can be the difference between winning and losing, as forcing a player to wait until turn 6 to play their 4-mana Wrath is far too slow to save you against the average aggro deck. In fact, this can actually be worse, as if your opponent doesn't draw enough lands, they may never be able to cast the spell you exiled. This is a bit unlikely, but it will often force your opponent to wait far more than 2 turns to draw enough lands to cast the exiled card. The final selling point for Spellbinder is that this is a very unique effect in white, as there aren't that many cards with this kind of ability. The closest are cards like Nevermore and Curse of Silence, but both of these cards don't let you look at your opponent's hand, and instead name a card like Meddling Mage does. While these cards can be better against certain combo decks, they're worse into the majority of the field. Spellbinder functions as some of the only discard-like hand interaction white has access to, an effect normally reserved for black cards. All of this combined makes Spellbinder a powerful card with a unique effect for its color, giving it a niche not only in Standard but occasionally in older formats as well. And number 2, we have Dark Confidant. This is a 2/1 human wizard with a mana cost of 1 and 1 black. It has the ability where, at the beginning of your upkeep, you reveal the top card of your library. You lose life equal to its mana value, and then put it into your hand. Dark Confidant is one of the cheapest cards in the game that will reliably draw you a card every single turn. The only cards that compete with it are cards like Sylvan Library, another very powerful card that has seen a long history of competitive play. Confidant is the kind of card your opponent kind of needs to answer right away, or it will simply bury them in an avalanche of card advantage turn after turn. Confidant isn't the best stat line around, as its 1 toughness makes it very easy to kill, and its lack of evasion or any other abilities makes it very weak in combat. Despite this, Dark Confidant has seen a ton of competitive play throughout the years simply because of how strong this ability is. Basically, any black mid-range deck since this card's printing has played the card, as the card draw alone is just too good to pass up. The downside of losing life can really hurt, but players can easily build around this. In fact, building your deck to be just as strong as possible will often stop Confidant from dealing too much damage to you. Players generally try to fill their deck with as many cheap spells as possible, so Confidant will only be taking a bit of life from you each turn. This means you aren't running too much of a risk of running yourself out of life with your own Confidant. This does make the card worse in aggro, but against the rest of the field, Confidant is a terrifying card to see come down on turn 2. While the card has historically seen a ton of play, it has slowly been power crept out of most formats. Confidant now sees very little play, as the format is just a bit too fast for a card that draws you a single card a turn. You can use cards like Fury to slow down the pace of a game, but doing so is very risky, as flipping it with Confidant will dome you for a quarter of your life total. Additionally, the existence of cards like Fury and Rend and 6 makes playing a 1 toughness creature in general a very bad idea, forcing cards like Confidant out of the format. While Confidant has seen a ton of play historically, there's one card that completely blows it out of the water in terms of usage over the years. And number 1, we have Snapcaster Mage. This is a 2/1 human wizard with the mana cost of 1 and 1 blue. It has Flash and the ability where, when it enters the battlefield, target instant and sorcery in your opponent's graveyard gains flashback until end of turn, and its flashback cost is equal to its mana cost. This means that you can cast the spell from your graveyard for its flashback cost, but you exile it afterwards. Snapcaster essentially lets you recast any instant or sorcery card in your graveyard for just 2 extra mana, getting you a 2/1 to boot. The ability to recast any of your spells from your graveyard out of nowhere gives Snapcaster a huge level of versatility. Drawing a copy of Snapcaster is kind of like drawing a copy of an instant or sorcery card in your graveyard. While this is true of cards like Regrowth as well, Snapcaster having both Flash and being a creature makes it a lot more powerful. It's a lot more similar to Eternal Witness in how it plays, except it has Flash and costs less for the same body. There are tons of ways to make even better use of the card. One of the most common plays was using Cryptic Command to counter an opponent's spell and bounce Snapcaster. This would let you redeploy Snapcaster to recast the very same Cryptic Command next turn, letting you bounce Snapcaster again to recast yet another spell. This wasn't infinite thanks to flashback exiling the spell, but you could loop this as many times as you wanted to get a ton of card advantage, though you didn't necessarily need to do this to make Snapcaster worth it. A very common line of play was lightning bolting the opponent, playing Snapcaster and recasting the bolt, and then attacking with Snapcaster on the following turn. This would hit for a total of 8 damage, ending the game in a single turn against an opponent who would usually be feeling pretty safe. Snapcaster was an absolute staple in multiple formats for years, and while it has fallen to the wayside over time thanks to power creep, it still crops up every now and again. Snapcaster is probably the most famous Invitational card, and overall the most played and powerful of the entire series of cards so far. Alright, and that's the list. As always, are there any cards you think we may have missed, or have any ideas for future videos just like this one? If so, please let us know down in the comment below.